and welcome to Scientists Falling TV. And today I'm very pleased to be joined once again by Dr. James Dyke and by Professor Sir Robert Watson. Now, Bob has been described as one of the most influential environmental scientists worldwide, contributing to multiple assessments of on international and national policies and actions. He's been an IPCC chair and co-chair, and then most recently he co-led the United Nations Environment Programme report, Making Peace with Nature, which was launched in February 2021. James is Assistant Director of the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. He's a science writer and columnist and has just published a book, Firestorm and Flood, The Violence of Climate Change. And both Bob and James, with Wolfgang Knorr, recently authored the now viral article, Net Zero is a Dangerous Trap, which was published in The Conversation and has been downloaded, I believe, over 1 million times, and probably still counting. So thank you both and welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
Right, now this week has seen the publication of the landmark IPCC AR6 report on the physical science, which has been much anticipated. And this week's also seen a leak of the AR6 Working Group 3 report on mitigation. And it's seen the unfolding of various tragedies, further wildfires, and a sort of peculiar situation in the UK with the Cambo oil field being signed off, and a dispute between Boris Johnson and the Treasury. I'd like to start by asking you both for your thoughts and reflections following publication of IPCC, the AR6 report on the physical science. So perhaps I could start with you, Bob, for your reflections on this as a seasoned IPCC chair.
It's a good report, but it doesn't say anything that we haven't said in the last 2 or 3 reports. The messages are clear. The climate is changing. We're seeing more extreme events. The cause of the changes are human induced, and the situation will continue to get worse as the emissions continue to increase. And if we want to meet the Paris target of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, we don't have very much wiggle room in the carbon budget. So all of this has been said before. I mean, I would argue we've said literally all of it since the report I chaired in 2002, the third assessment. The language is stronger, the attribution statements are stronger, but the message has been clear for 20 years that we humans are changing the Earth's climate, and if we don't want to have significant adverse consequences of those changes, we need to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases urgently. So I think this report is good. The media have clearly picked it up well. They've got the message. Time is not on our side. I think they could have been a little bit clearer on the urgency of the next 10 years. It's more implicit than explicit in the document. They have a nice table of carbon budgets of how much is left if we want to reach the 1.5 or the 2 degrees Celsius. So they could have, I think they were clearer in their 1.5 report, but it is a good report. It has urgency in the report. The real question is whether governments will take any notice of it any more than the previous reports.
Yeah, I think that's a very good summary. Yes, James, your reflections, any surprises for you in the report?
No, is the short answer. So unsurprisingly, I agree with everything that Bob has just said. I was expecting the language to be revised upwards regards to the levels of certainty and to what extent we are sure of this, and increasing our confidence in attribution of extreme weather as a consequence of human-caused climate change. It would have been nice to have seen maybe wider discussion or more headlining of the discussion around tipping points and large, abrupt, potential non-linear changes in the climate system. But the thing is, of course, that's currently the hardest thing, or one of the hardest things to try to understand about the climate system. I suppose at the moment, you just can't rule them out. It's not something you'd want to bet against. Now, with regards to what extent that's going to cut through in a policy context, probably not at all. because you're not able to quantify, you're not able to say, to give a kind of a representation of what the risk is. You just say it's out there lurking somewhere. And you're dealing with a sort of a policy system that it's dealing, you know, in 15-minute segments of attention span. You know, it doesn't give a monkeys right now about what could happen at some point beyond the middle of this century or something. So it was, and it, you know, we need to remember it is a tremendous scientific and academic achievement to be able to do this in the first place. There was very good coverage. There was some disappointing coverage, which was interpreted the report as it's too late. It doesn't matter what we do. We've locked in warming, you know, and that's because they weren't really understanding potential pathways or scenarios to 1.5 or limiting to 1.5. And then the next day it was, you know, back to business as usual, really. You know, we had our moment in the Sun and the Daily Mail and the Express and the other international news media. And, you know, now we're on to the next story. The question, of course, is this going to cut through when it comes to Glasgow later this year for COP26, which is being billed as the make or break? I still think everything is to play for. And I think the at least Working Group 1 assessment report shows that everything is still to play for. You know, we can do this. We've got the opportunity, we've got the capability, we've got technology, we know what to do. The question is, of course, are we going to do it? Yeah,
okay. And you're right, it's galling to have this really, you know, earth-shattering report delivered and reported on comprehensively, and then the next day we are back to business as usual, as you say, and, you know, and reporting on things that are important but are, you know, an order of a magnitude different to the crisis we're currently in. I was interested in how scientists and activists have responded to the report themselves. So have you gauged anything from their responses? Because obviously both of you are, you know, at the heart of the scientific community.
James, why don't you go?
Okay. Well, I keep my ear to Twitter. And I've been having some interesting discussions with academics and maybe activists, people who are engaged in the kind of climate policy system in different ways. I think one thing that's going to be very interesting is going beyond the physical basis to things like Working Group 2, which looks at the impacts, and then Working Group 3, which is meant to be plotting pathways to, you know, limit warming to no more than 1.5 or 2 or something. Because that's where you kind of might see something potentially not necessarily transformative, but really that's kind of where the action is. You know, as Bob said, we've known for decades what the big story about climate change is. The latest kind of physical assessments are kind of just refining more of it and becoming, you know, producing a bit more precision to the budget and narrowing climate sensitivity ranges and things like this. They're all tweaks. You know, what we don't need right now are tweaks. We need these big leaps. And the big leaps we need is in rapid decarbonisation. Now, it has been pointed out on a number of occasions, certainly in the past, that when you look at the summary for policymakers in these reports, it doesn't really mention fossil fuels. It doesn't really mention the burning of coal, oil and gas as producing emissions. It sort of doesn't really discuss directly the driver of climate change, and therefore it doesn't necessarily directly engage with the urgent need to stop burning fossil fuels, right? Which is arguably one of the greatest challenges we've ever faced. So that's certainly where the action is going to be. That's where the action is going to be running up to Paris. Also, there is something brewing around 1.5, because if you look at Working Group 1 report, it seems to conclude that it's no longer possible to limit warming to no more than 1.5. The best that's on offer is an overshoot, and then large-scale deployment, or at least significant deployment of carbon removals from sort of the middle of this century onwards that will drag us back down to 1.5. So it's already beginning to sort of not give up on the Paris Agreement, but that kind of highest ambition is sort of being interpreted now by the IPCC as sort of necessarily requiring an overshoot, because the assumption is we won't decarbonize fast enough. And that's a really interesting assumption that perhaps we do need to look at in a bit more depth.
Okay, interesting. I'll come back to some of those points, but Bob, reflections from you. I mean, how have your scientist colleagues responded to this?
I've only talked to a couple, actually. and they both have thought it's a very good report. I've looked to see how different scientists have been quoted in the media, and I think, again, all of them view this report to be a very solid report and sending a solid message to governments. But again, I don't believe anyone was particularly surprised by the report. It's incredibly thorough. There's no question whatsoever. I don't read the report as making any assumptions of whether politically we can or cannot reach 1.5. I personally think the numbers speak for themselves. I'm just looking at the table, basically, SPM2, and it says if you want to hit 1.5, what is the budget left for a 50%, only a 50% chance of it, and it's 500 gigatons. That's exactly 10 years worth of current emissions. If you want a higher percentage chance of hitting 1.5, say even a 2/3 chance, we've only got 400 gigatons left. That's only 8 years at current emissions. And when you look at the UNEP gap report, and we did that in Making Peace with Nature, the current pledges, they don't take the new ones that came out in the Biden meeting a few months ago, but China and India, if anything, they'll be comparable in 2030 to what they are today. They might be a little bit below it. And so in reality, I don't see that there is much political chance of having emissions in 2030 being 50% lower than they are today, which is what you really require to try and have a budget of roughly 500 gigatons between now and 2050. So I think if you read between the lines, I think the odds of hitting 1.5, I'll be honest, I think they're slim to zero. I think the odds of hitting 2 are pretty slim, to be quite candid. James almost sounds a bit more optimistic than me. I hope James is right. I'm just not optimistic, to be quite candid with you. But I don't read that these scientists are making a judgment of what is plausible or not. If anything, I think they make it look a little too easy to hit a 1.5 or 2. But as James has correctly said, I think Working Group 2 is going to be a critical report which talks about what are the impacts of these changes in mean temperature, precipitation, but even more, what are the implications of the extreme events, which they talk about a lot in the document, on food security, water security, human health, displacement of people, impacts on nature. And I think when governments start to look at what the incredible implications are, which we already told them about, I mean, it won't be new again. I think they're going to say, my God, not only is temperature changing, climate changing, but there really are threats to development, to the economy. And then it comes to Working Group 3, as James has said, is absolutely critical. What will Working Group 3 say about the transition to a low carbon economy? How can we deal with aviation? How can we deal with shipping? How can we deal with agriculture? And they're the really tough ones. Agriculture, aviation and shipping are going to be some of the tough ones. And I'm hoping that it will address these rather well.
Yeah, I mean, that is one thing that is noticeable in the report, that the report is quite clear that some of these more extreme scenarios can no longer be ruled out. So, for example, things like dramatic rises in sea level, which is alarming. Much of what's contained in the report is alarming. I just want to go back to something that James commented on earlier. So this is a question really, and it's about the influence of policies on those scenarios that the working groups work with. And given that the Working Group 3 is already working on and honing its report, does that mean that there will be a gap, if you like, between what we need to do and what Working Group 3 will say should be done? Because this is a question, are the recommendations that the group likely to make, are they likely to be coloured by some, if you like, constraints on what is politically and economically possible and feasible that will simply not suit the present situation? Care to comment?
Well, there's a question. I'll have a go at this, but I think we you know, Bob's going to give us some really quite juicy stuff, I hope. What's interesting is the working group one, the physical basis of climate change. You can read between the lines, but you're not meant to. They'll just give you the budget, right? So if you want if you want a likelihood of 50% or 67% or 83%, this is our best estimate of how much carbon you've got. And really, one way to understand that is that how you burn that carbon, how you use that budget, is a question for wider society. It's about a big political bun fight. It's about these big conference of the parties. It's geopolitics. You know, it's what working group 3 have to do is they're meant to come up with various scenarios that say, okay, well, if you want a 50% likelihood of 1.5, and then if the budget is this big, then these are the ways we think you can get there. And what's interesting is when you're looking at working group 3, there won't be any scenarios that they provide that will give you a better than 50%. They won't give you a scenario that gives you a 67% or an 83%, because their integrated assessment models, the tools they use to try and find these scenarios, just can't do it. You know, they can't get those models to undertake such aggressive rates of decarbonisation. Now, that's because we build these models with certain assumptions, and arguably you'd need different models to be able to undertake very, very rapid kind of climate mitigation as well as adaptation, everything else. So it is interesting. On the one hand, we're kind of presented with the opportunity to limit no more than 1.5, but certainly there's an awful lot of skepticism as if that was going to be possible, or if it was ever possible, given the way politics kind of functions. You know, you don't need a crystal ball to be able to come to the conclusion that the probability of us limiting to 1.5 are very, very slim, given how politics functions, given how the global economy works. Of course, there is an interesting question: could we ever reconfigure that global economy? Could we do different politics? Right? That's certainly never going to be in an IPCC report. You know, it's as much as the scenarios can explore possible spaces in working group 3, that's completely beyond their remit, right? So it's interesting to look at the role that these reports can play in sort of maintaining existing kind of politics, the way in which they can be used. I think there's a bit of skepticism at times when politicians come out and say we're on track for Paris, because you can at least find one scenario that will limit you. But even those scenarios, they all require really, really aggressive mitigation. And there doesn't seem to be any probability or chance that's going to emerge anytime soon.
Bob?
Yeah, the reason working group 3 is delayed relative to working group 1 is in order that working group 3 can take into account the latest scenarios in working group 1. And that makes sense. However, wasn't particularly needed this time, in the sense that the 1.5 report that came out, you know, a year and a half or 2 years ago said the same thing as this report. The numbers are refined a little bit, but only refined a little bit. So working group 3 has a very good idea of what it would take to reach 1.5 or 1.7 or 2, or failing that, higher numbers. What I would like to see more explicitly in a working group 3 reports are the 3 approaches to mitigation. What's the technical potential? In other words, ignore politics, ignore economics. What is the technical potential? And there's no question we have the technical potential, as James has already said, to meet 1.5. But then that's not the real world. So what's the market potential? There you start to take the economics into account. You start to take some of the barriers as well as the opportunities for market penetration, which also allows for, you know, premature retirement of our current capital stock. But then the real issue is, what's the real world like? Because it won't even reach the market potential. And that's when the socio-political realities come in, basically. How does China look at this? How does the US look at this? How does India look at this? The big players, basically. And what I'm concerned about is we may end up with a whole bunch of pledges in Glasgow that look very good on paper, but are they real? So, for example, take the UK, the 78% reduction by 2035 is an excellent pledge by the British government. But when you look at the climate change committee report, they said the UK government is not on target for the third carbon budget, or the fourth, or the fifth. And unless they're on target for the third, fourth, and fifth, they haven't got a hope in hell of being on target for the sixth, which is the 78% by 2035. The government, while they talk about the large reductions, they haven't put the policies in place to help to stimulate the private sector and individuals meet these targets. So I would hope that when governments go to Glasgow, they don't only tell us what their goals and targets are. What are the actions? What are the policies that would give us any hope of meeting these? Otherwise, once again, we're fooling ourselves and we're fooling the public of what are we going to adapt to? If we pretend we can adapt to that we only have to adapt to 1.5 to 2, but in reality, we're going to be seeing 2.5 to 3, it will actually stop most governments around the world putting in place the adaptation strategies they need for a 2.5, 3 degree world. So we need some real honesty from all of the big emitters about what can they truly achieve. And while I've been critical of the UK, in the US, the real question is most Republican senators and most Republican House members don't believe in climate change. While Biden will push very hard to get a 50% reduction by 2030, I think he's going to have one hell of a fight on his hand. I hope he wins because it's the right thing to do. But it's not a foregone conclusion that the US can live up to what it's saying it will try and do.
Yeah, it's sobering. It's sobering, and it's almost as if the public discourse on the one hand talks about striving towards 1.5, and yet we know that within, for example, the Committee on Climate Change, which has recommended preparing for 3 degrees, and it's unclear whether the public are aware of this, because we haven't really had for many years a significant public engagement campaign, which would prepare public for what's happening and give them some indication about, maybe give them some idea of choices and so forth. I'm sort of hesitant to say what's gone wrong, but I mean, purely from the perspective of the science and the sort of policy interface, what do you think has been going wrong? Because scientists' warnings aren't heeded. They have a shelf life of, I don't know, 24, 48 hours, and then they're gone. Putting your name to a paper, sign-on letters don't really seem to have a great deal of impact unless it's a particular niche thing like the rewilding campaign, which we can talk about in a minute. And glossy films don't really work either. So what is it that we can do? And just as an example, Simon Lewis in The Guardian this week, writing almost in an exasperated way, said, well, you can go and join an Extinction Rebellion protest. So for scientists, there's this sudden leap between publishing papers, speaking at conferences and so on, and then, oh my God, what are we going to do? We're actually going to have to get out in the streets. So something has clearly gone wrong there. Who would like to jump in first?
Well, in the US, let me jump in first. In the US, the power of the vested lobby is mind-boggling. And in fact, a couple of years ago, there were several big articles saying there are probably 4 highly priced lobbyists per member of Congress. In other words, probably over 2,000 lobbyists, and their only job was to try and stop any action on climate change. Incredibly highly paid, largely lawyers, basically. And what did they want to stop? Well, they wanted to make sure that we didn't change subsidies on fossil fuels, direct or indirect. And what I mean by indirect is if you don't internalize the externalities, that is to say, the social, economic, environmental cost of fossil fuels, it's basically a subsidy. It's an indirect subsidy. And so there's a lot of people out there who actually want cheap fossil fuels, want the status quo, and they lobby and lobby like hell, and they're powerful, much more powerful than any scientist, basically. I can talk to 1 or 2 congressmen or senators, possibly, if I can get access. These guys have got access all the time, basically. But these aren't always easy issues. So, for example, in the UK again, why hasn't the British government just said point blank, the Cumbria new coal mine should not be even considered, basically? So it's now viewed as a local issue, and there will be hearings on the Cumbria coal mine. I mean, if it were to go ahead, it would send a terrible signal to the rest of the world. There's plenty of coking coal in the world today, basically. We don't need any more. We need to revise the way we make steel, basically. So there are vested interests, but governments have a hard time making decisions. And the Cumbrian coal mine is an example. Should there be another Heathrow Airport runway? All of these are challenge. I'm not saying they're easy issues, they're challenging. So you've got vested interest from some parts of the private sector, certainly not all. You've got challenges within governments, basically. And so, we as scientists can say what the issues are, but in that real world out there, it's a real fight.
James?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, it must be decades now since we've disabused ourselves of a kind of an information deficit model. The assumption being that scientists were going to provide all the information on what's happening to the climate and that humans are responsible, and even be able to peer into the future and see what was going to happen. And then politicians and wider society were going to go, oh, thank you very much for that. And they were going to act accordingly. Well, that hasn't happened, and it will never happen for the reasons that Bob has just been talking about, because it's only a relatively tiny fraction of humanity which are doing everything they possibly can to continue fossil fuel use, because this is how they have been able to accrete all that wealth and influence and power, and sometimes, political power, capital P, over the past few centuries, because fossil fuels have literally built our civilization. So they've not just built the bricks and the mortars and the roads and the infrastructure. They built our political institutions, and in some nations they're still largely running those political institutions either through lobbying, through party finance, through funding shady think tanks which are constantly churning out all this kind of misinformation campaigns and doing everything they possibly can to stop us effectively responding to the problem. So, one way to look at it is, if, humanity's in this kind of attractor space, and whenever you're trying to get something out of an attractor, you need to give it energy, you need to drive it out into some other kind of attractor. And there are tremendously powerful forces keeping it in, So if we're going to make progress in the very little time that we've got left, that means directly confronting those forces of delay, which is not an academic's day job. And we don't sign up to do that. We sign up to teach and write papers. There wasn't anything in the contract about, chaining myself to railings or getting arrested. Surely there's a bit in between, right? There's the bit where I can, do my practice and not end up in a police cell. There's some ways in which I can get much more involved and engaged in the broad societal debates. And I think the link comes from us being able to be a bit more vocal and outspoken about how our research and our academic activities are used and sometimes, abused, and being more mindful of the consequences of some of the research. So certainly when you look at, international geopolitics, you can get very, very depressed because the forces just seem to be immense.
Well, I mean, a couple of quick examples about the power of the lobby. I'll use two totally different ones. The National Rifle Association in the USA. Well, a lot of Americans do believe they have a right to carry on. Most would actually like to try and stop these mass shootings, basically, and have some limitations. But the power of the NRA is mind-boggling. In France, the agricultural subsidies, which underpin, the common agricultural policy, the power of the farmers wanting those agricultural subsidies, which again have adverse effects on both climate change and the loss of biodiversity, because it leads obviously to excessive use of agrochemicals that can be actually quite bad for both climate and biodiversity. So it isn't just in the field of climate change where the lobby is powerful. you can think about almost every field that we've got, and there are lobbyists there that are trying to stop change in the direction that we need to transform our society.
Okay, and on that point, Bob, it seemed like a good point to move on to rewilding and land inequality. So, as you know, I've been involved in the Rewild campaign. You've very kindly supported that. And it's a campaign that seems to have some traction, you know, perhaps because it seems relatively painless to the average individual, and it also seems to be apolitical to some degree. But how much confidence do you have in us achieving some success in terms of calling for rewilding in the context where, for example, you've got 50% of England owned by less than 1% of the population, and in Scotland, apparently 450 individuals own half the land? I mean, do you have much confidence in us actually being able to achieve something here?
I actually don't know. I'll be quite candid with you. I think if the royal family were to rewild even a reasonable percentage of their land holdings, that would send a really interesting signal to other big landholders. I mean, Prince Charles has always been very positive about nature, very positive about addressing climate change. I mean, on his place down in the countryside, he has a small amount of his land set aside for nature, basically. It's not a large percentage, but it's a step in the right direction. Other members of the royal family seem to care a lot also about climate change and nature. So if the royal family were to start to rewild some of their estate, that could really send a wonderful signal to other big landholders. Now, I read an article only two or 3 days ago about someone that had a significant piece of land. I'm going to probably get this wrong. I think it was on BBC in Ireland, and he suddenly decided to rewild a very large percentage of his land, and he's been horrendously criticised by a lot of people that it looks ugly. Why are you taking away good arable land where we need food? Why you got this, you know, messy looking thing? So there will be some people, for different reasons, might actually fight against it, which is really a rather sad situation. Because I think that for the average person, and I don't want to be rude to the average person, they love nature. I think the average person in England cares about nature. I'm not sure they all understand why a wild piece of nature is more valuable than maybe a highly managed piece of nature. And therefore we got a little bit more education to do, to be quite honest. But there's no question the average person in England does seem to care. When I was in DEFRA as the chief scientific advisor, there was Caroline Spellman was the minister, and she put out a document about considering selling off more of the forest land in England. And it hit incredible resistance, She didn't say they were going to do it. I want to make sure she was understood. She put it out for consultation. Anyway, in the end, Cameron said, no, we can't do that. And the British really rose up and said, we like our forests. So I think there is an innate feeling in the British public that they do like nature. They like walking by a pristine river or by a lake. They like walking in the forest. So I think if one can shape the rewilding campaign and get especially 1 or 2 people to take a lead, and that's often all you need is a few to take the lead, then it might have some real possibilities. I hope it does, because England has the lowest amount of forests in the whole of Europe, basically. We cut it down a long while ago, as you know.
Exactly. It staggers me that we describe, you know, areas of outstanding natural beauty, and they're anything but natural. I mean, the Lake District is denuded. It's
and the
really
Cotswolds.
quite.
I love driving through the Cotswolds, and I love driving through the Lake, but they're not wild.
No, exactly. You have to go to the west coast of Scotland to see proper wild. Okay, I just want to ask you both a final question, and it's a tough one, isn't it? But from where you're both sitting at the moment, with COP just around the corner, what do you think is going to happen?
I'll let James go first.
Okay. Well, I have polished my crystal ball, and I did ask it earlier today. There's not going to be any transformation in terms of ambition, but as Bob said earlier, action. What we need is action. One thing I'm particularly interested in is trying to go beyond net zero promises to maybe something like twin targets. So what we've got the opportunity at COP26 is to demand that when they come up with their NDCs, what their promises for future, responses to climate change would be, that we put a laser-like focus on what their plans are to actually decarbonize. What are their plans to stop burning coal, oil and gas? And if they don't really have any, or they got vague promises at some point, in the next 20 or 30 years, then they should be ruthlessly and continually and, remorselessly called out as just more denial and delay on the climate and ecological crisis. So I think that's one thing that we've got an opportunity to coordinate around and try and apply some pressure. So that's maybe an optimistic answer about what COP26 could deliver. I do worry that what COP26 is going to end up delivering is the kind of the sermon for the wake of 1.5. It's going to be preparing wider society for the inevitable end of the highest climate ambition. And the message will probably be something like, we tried everything, we strained every sinew, but unfortunately the physics was just beyond us and we couldn't do it. Whereas in reality, we didn't even try. So it's not as if we failed to limit warming to no more than 1.5. That opportunity for a safe and stable climate for our children and future generations was actively taken away from us, right? So I think that's something that we must be on guard against, this notion of fatalism and doomism, though there's nothing we can do, almost as a kind of consequence of the physics or the dynamics of the climate system. It was always, and it has been for decades, all about choices. And some people have decided to continue to burn fossil fuels because of wealth and influence and power. And whilst they are only a tiny fraction of humanity, they are vastly more powerful than the majority of humanity. So I think that's, on the one hand, the optimism we've got with COP26, with twin targets and demanding actual action on decarbonisation. But then I think the thing we need to be mindful of and be on guard against continually is this, I'm sorry, there was nothing we could do about it.
Absolutely. And it would be unbelievably disempowering for individuals. It would be almost like a refutation of human agency to go into that particular space. Bob, what are your thoughts?
I didn't expect that answer from James. He may well be right. I still think that the governments will put some pledges on the table and say we're moving in the right direction for 1.5 to 2. They may be ambiguous and say we're moving in a direction to achieve Paris, which of course could still be the 2 or less than 2 degrees. If James is correct that they might actually admit defeat, it will be very disempowering. However, it's probably the truth. And the truth is actually what we have to deal with. We need to deal with the real world. So what we need to, I think the governments have to talk about 2 totally different things. What will they do between now and 2030? What are the actions? We know what we need, 50% reduction of all emissions by 2030. What are they going to do to try and achieve that? Or if not, what are they going to do to try to achieve globally, that is 25%. So really we need to focus on what actions will they take in the next 10 years. That will actually tell us to what degree are they on a pathway to net zero. But then with net zero, there's a bit of smoke and mirrors. Only about half of the G20 have made any commitments. I think there's about 12 countries have made a commitment for net zero. That's out of 12 out of the G20. But it's a bit of smoke and mirrors in the sense that not all of them say they'll cover all greenhouse gases. Some don't talk about whether they will, how they include aviation and shipping. How do they deal with offsets? In other words, when we talk about net zero, I think we need some really strict criteria of what constitutes net zero, what gases, how do we deal with offsets, etc., etc., etc. So we need some real rules around net zero. But as you know, obviously the short document James and I helped to write is effectively that it's the next 10 years that we really, really have to focus on, not to actually rely on unproven technologies in the middle of the century. So large-scale reforestation, not a good idea. Large-scale, I misspoke. Large-scale reforestation with native species, quite appropriate. Restoration of degraded eco with native species, good. Large-scale afforestation with monoculture, not a good idea. And very large-scale bioenergy with monocultures replacing native vegetation, not a good idea. And I hope Working Group 3 really looks at this in great detail. What is the potential of bioenergy? What is the potential of reforestation, appropriate afforestation, small scale? So we need Working Group 3 to do a really critical analysis of this. Is carbon capture and storage even economically feasible? Can we store the carbon dioxide in the ground? So there's some real questions. So I would hope, and hope, of course, is my word, Glasgow would really focus on the next 5 to 10 years, now to 2030. And if they keep on talking about net zero, let's have a real discussion of what net zero really means. That when someone says it, we know they truly mean taking all emissions into account and how they would actually be balanced, basically. I do expect the governments to put a spin on this, that we are on a track to Paris. What I want to see is honesty, so we'll know what we have to adapt to.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point on which to end. We do need to start having that conversation about adaptation. It's a point Chris Stark made just in recent weeks. Okay, well, thank you both so much for your time, for a great conversation as always, James. Thank you so much, Bob.
Okay, great talk, dude. Good seeing you, James.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Alison.
Bye.